My name is Gregory, and I'll be presenting on monopolies today. I want to talk about how we conceptualize monopolies in our day-to-day lives, any stigmas that have been attached to monopolies, and what an Austrian economist would have to say about monopolies in a competitive market. There's a common misconception that monopolies arise naturally out of perfectly competitive markets, in that a company will outdo its competitors and continue to attain market share at the cost of its competitors, leaving only itself and maybe one or two other competitors in the field. However, this is not true. Austrian economists would push back against this, saying that monopolies do not happen naturally in a competitive environment. Rather, monopolies will eventually tumble and fall to new competitors entering the field. These competitors may be more cost efficient, more innovative, or what have you. However, they do lead to the eventual demise of any monopolistic competitors within a certain industry. So what exactly is a monopoly? A monopoly is an exclusive privilege granted by the state or literally one seller within an industry. This is not exactly commonplace within the United States or any competitive market in the world. However, the meaning monopoly has shifted to make some industries seem a little bit more monopolistic. Today, monopoly tends to mean any firm facing a falling demand curve. This according to the Concise Guide to Economics. Let's take a look at this graph for market share of smartphones, this coming from a study in 2011. In our new sense of monopoly, we would see that this Google share, which currently has 41.8% of the market, would increase and basically block out any other competitors. Apple may remain, however, it would have a market share that would be next to meaningless. From this graph, it would seem that Google is well on its way to a monopoly, close to double the amount of market share that Apple has. This graph from 2014 would show that despite the initial monopolistic tendencies of Google, which is what Samsung tends to run, by the way, despite those initial monopolistic tendencies, they actually lose market share to more innovative companies, with other platforms taking 40% of the market share in this instance. This is not exactly prevalent in every industry. However, smartphones are particularly relevant nowadays and tend to favor either the Google platform, Apple platform, or Microsoft platform, which some will consider monopolistic or oligopolistic, depending on who you ask. However, this is a perfect example showing that monopolies do not arise out of competition. Rather, innovation and more efficient companies rise from perfectly competitive markets. But what happens when a monopoly is granted by the government and allowed to persist without any competition whatsoever? Let's take a look at the United States Postal Service for a second. The United States Postal Service has been an efficient means of communication for centuries. People have relied on it to carry letters across the country and around the world for decades. However, today, with the age of email, instant messaging, etc., the United States Postal Service is hurting. That hurt is coming from the fact that it is no longer needed. The system put in place by the United States Postal Service requires us to sit down, write a letter, and buy a stamp and send it out. However, we no longer need to do that to communicate with someone on the other side of the world. The business is being kept alive by a state-granted monopoly, which allows it to function regardless of cost, regardless of demand, and quite frankly is an inefficient use of taxpayer money. We can see here that there are rapidly declining sales volumes, revenues, and increasing amounts of expenses. This would simply not be allowed to happen in a competitive environment, one in which other companies would be allowed to innovate and not be protected by the United States government in the case of loss. Here are two competitors for the United States Postal Service, both of which are unprotected by the United States government and do not have monopolies like the United States Postal Service does. Their services differ in that the United States Postal Service also delivers letters and small correspondences such as letters. However, the UPS and FedEx, while capable of conducting such services, often has to resort to the United States Postal Service as their final deliverer for such small packages. Had the United States Postal Service not been granted a monopoly by the government, they would be out of business, where companies like FedEx and UPS have to innovate and operate more efficiently in order to stay alive. They would not be allowed to have the falling revenues like the previous graph demonstrated for the United States Postal Service. Let's look at what happens in the real world when competitive environments are allowed to function as they should. Amtrak is a state-granted monopoly on railway travel within the United States. Currently, there are no other companies really allowed to provide transit services on railways across the United States. Let's look at this map of Amtrak's ridership by station. As you can see, it's focused mostly on East Coast metropolitan areas, including Chicago in this case. This is by no means a useful situation for commuters in America. Unless you're situated on the East Coast, where states are closer together, major metropolitan areas are often tied together by roads and train tracks within a relatively short distance. This is not a useful means of transportation at all. Because there is no competition allowed in the industry, there is no need for the company to produce more stations, more railroads, more infrastructure that would allow more people to access railways within the United States. This means that a select few number of people are really capable of using the system, and really shuts out a large number of Americans from using the railways in the United States. As you can see from this graph from the European Commission, air travel has continued to grow despite numerous events that would seemingly prevent passengers from using air travel. Air travel, while regulated for safety reasons, still remains relatively free market. This allows the companies to innovate, become more cost efficient, and generally make the experience supposedly better for the customer. While this remains to be seen as to the customer experience, the efficiency of air travel has increased, allowing it to take market share from a monopolized industry, namely that of Amtrak. In this instance, an industry grew from the remains of a monopolized industry into an innovative and generally more preferable customer experience that allows people to get places quicker without the moral hazard of a government-sponsored monopoly that basically kills all innovation and efficiency within an industry. This only further serves to prove the Austrian economist's point that monopoly does not typically rise out of a competitive industry, but rather it is a government-sponsored event that occurs when a government only wants one, maybe two companies to perform in an industry. Otherwise, a government can sponsor a monopoly if it is protecting certain industries from international forces of competition. To quote the Concise Guide to Economics, no market-earned business monopoly can forcibly eliminate its competitors or forcibly require revenues from its customers the way the United States Postal Service office and the other government-granted monopolies such as Amtrak do as a matter of routine. To conclude, monopolies do not arise naturally out of a competitive situation. Large companies will inevitably fall to smaller companies that are more innovative, more efficient, or make a generally better product. There is no guarantee of success in an industry unless it is granted by the government, such as the United States Post Office or Amtrak, which are only a couple of monopolies that are granted by the state and federal governments in the United States.